Hello and welcome to a kind of final development sort of wrap-up video for the Pizza Time Collaborative project. Today I've got with me Will and James, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Will. I'm one of the senior designers.
Hey, I'm James. I'm one of the lead artists.
And we're just going to go through kind of talking about how we work together, how we came to some of the decisions in the game, and just overall go through the whole project. Okay, so I guess I'll start with the prototype. So I think early on, it was when we were all throwing together ideas, it was sort of decided that we were going to do some sort of a mix between kind of Tony Hawk's and Spyro. And I don't know if either of you remember who came up with the idea of like the ingredients getting laid on top of the pizza first.
I'm not sure that I do. There were a lot of different decisions that were made at the beginning, but we all came to a sort of group consensus on these things.
Yeah, so one of the first big things that the prototype had is it had the kind of core flight mechanics, and it had the ability to, as you collected kind of the puzzle pieces, as you collected the ingredients, they kind of layer on top of the pizza, which was kind of the real initial draft behind it. Do you guys remember early on toying with sort of barrel roll controls as well, with the pizza being able to sort of
Yes.
spin? And I think I remember it making people quite nauseous early on. Um,
Yeah.
It was
that was one.
difficult to control as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was kind of awkward to orientate yourself. That was one of like the first things that got cut basically because after testing around with it, we found not the best for nausea. We kind of leaned a bit too heavy on the kind of realistic sort of flight controls. Where now I think the game is much more arcadey and it suits the aesthetic, the theme, and kind of the overall goal that we were going for. Um, right, so I've got written down here that the first thing really to go into is kind of the ingredient mechanics, so the actual puzzles that you solve whilst playing the game, which were kind of all conceived by Will. So if you want to sort of talk a bit about them, in fact, let's give you some sort of order. So like the spinach crates, I guess is the first one, and I suppose to lump in the targets with that because they're about kind of similar.
Yeah. Well, we wanted to create some objectives which all tied into the main player mechanics of the game. So you've got uh, objectives that require you to shoot, such as the spinach crates and the targets. Obviously, you've got stationary targets of which you've got to hit a lot of, and then you've got the slightly harder pepperoni targets, which you've got to try and hit as they're moving around in the environment. And then obviously another one of the main mechanics in the game is just being able to move and fly about. And so for that, we decided to have again sort of like stationary targets, which are quite easy to fly through, but you've got to do so in the correct order, which is where the sort of main challenge comes from those, and also not hit the sides of the rings. And then you've got the ghost pepper, of which you've got to sort of like try and collect these peppers in a short amount of time. Again, you've got to try and sort of do it in the correct order, otherwise you're unlikely to get all of the peppers. And then the main sort of last of the core objectives would be the mushroom ball, and again that sort of like ties into the movement as well. Again, you've got to try and hit it in the correct angle to try and get it into a goal basically. So all of the objectives were really tying into like the main simple core mechanics that exist within the game. On top of that, we had some sort of like additional objectives and secret objectives. The secret objective to be able to get the golden pineapple or the pineapple, you had to try and shoot a crane, fill it up with sauce, and get it to move and sort of break down this chicken. And that was inspired by that idea. Actually, came from Jack, if I remember correctly. That
Well,
was
I
inspired
remember
by
we were
yeah,
talking about like so we had the five core ingredients and we had the secret pineapple, but the five core ingredients, like you say, kind of they just plays on the main movement shooting in the game. But
yeah,
the game was lacking kind of spectacle. There was no like
yeah. We wanted something more cinematic, definitely.
yeah, so we looped to the kind of Tony Hawk's I think it's Underground 2 levels for inspiration where you do some sort of a sequence and that would cause the level to shift. I think one thing we wanted to do with it was to have each level have a different version of this mechanic, so something that changed how the level. But I guess it was kind of a spectacle piece that let you get this pineapple.
Mm.
Unfortunately, I think that's one of the things that we never quite got around to doing. They all kind of used this crane, and it would have been nice to kind of
Yeah,
have some variety. But obviously, time constraints being what they were, we didn't quite get around to that. But I remember the crane was like a bit more complicated, right? When you first handed it to me, it wasn't just you shoot it, you fill it up, and
definitely.
it goes. I believe the original thing Will sent is that you'd you'd shoot it to make it go, then you'd spin dash into the crane to make it move, and then you'd spin dash into the ball.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the things through testing that we very quickly noticed was like it was
had
just
too many steps.
It was just too much. Like when all the other things were quite simple, it was one of the more complicated, I guess, mechanics, and not in a good way. It was kind of just a bit sort of overcomplicated. So I suppose with that as well, that brings you on.
Spin. It's interesting you mentioned that the spin dash is definitely something which changed over the course of the game's development. Like originally, it was going to be more of like a core function of the game and sort of like an alternative to the firing. But to be honest with you, it just felt slightly redundant, so it got changed through development to become just sort of like a temporary speed boost. So it still retains some usefulness, but the core design of it definitely changed. The other homage to Tony Hawk's is obviously the pizza letters, which sort of like fill in the position of the skate letters.
But yeah, that was an easy one to pick up, I think. And I think, to be fair, the pizza letters were what the ingredients originally were. And the prototype, you just pick up the ingredients, and we realised it's kind of boring because you're just flying around picking stuff up, which is why we kind of took what was the mechanics for the ingredients and turned them into the pizza letters, and then added this new kind of puzzle elements with the ingredients. The spin dash for sure is something that changed massively. And early on we thought, oh, it's going to be nice to have variations on the shot that you know, different puzzles you have to solve with it. But it was just, again, it's a very simple game, so it became a hard idea to come across. But I'd almost argue that the spin dash is like actually more valuable as what it is now, which is a way to quickly traverse the levels. You see people using it much more often than they would have.
Better as a boost.
And I guess that brings me on to, I guess, talking about the art of the ingredients. So sort of, what was your kind of direction, I guess, James, for when talking to your juniors about doing some of these ingredient pieces, and obviously the ones you made yourselves?
So the main thing we wanted to do was keep it stylized, make it as stylized as possible. We also took into consideration how the shader would work with everything. So we decided right at the start I decided right at the start I wanted to make a cartoon shader that would bring all the textures together. So we got that done in the first couple of weeks and then adjusted it throughout the project. But yeah, the idea was keep it as simple as possible, keep it very stylized, and just so it all fit together, we made the shader.
And I guess, like, specifically to ask about, because obviously the red onion rings was something that you ended up developing, and I think like something's quite interesting that you decided to kind of have this fade as opposed to having it just like one solid color.
Yeah, with feedback from the lecturers, they said it'd be nice to add a gradient to everything we were making. So when I decided to make these red onion rings that you went through, I wanted to add a gradient to that, just so it stood out a bit more.
And that kind of leads us on to talking about how me and James worked together to develop some of the kind of the tech art for the game. So this kind of onion ring is one example that when you pass through it, the onion ring changes to a shade of green. And obviously the purple made it, you know, you wouldn't be able to see that, but this thin ring of white lets you be able to kind of see this change in color. And more importantly, having this kind of bleed of the white on the back of the onion ring serves a mechanical purpose of being able to tell, even if you're on the opposite side of the ring, if it's active or not. And these kind of spinach crates are another example where I went in and kind of with some direction from James on how to develop these assets, developed technical materials that would help highlight things in the game. So one of the major pieces of feedback we were receiving about the spinach crates is it wasn't so obvious they were something you interacted with. With the pepperoni targets, it's pretty easy to tell, you know, they're targets because they look like targets. But the spinach crates, it was harder to tell they were something you shot. So I created kind of this flashing green material. And if I jump into my map here, you'll see some of the other bits of kind of tech art on display. So didn't know tons about the artistic process throughout this project. So a lot of times I was kind of asking James, how do the UVs interact? How does this operate? And the wart was the main one where really kind of figuring out the sort of magic you can pull off with normals. So the water has kind of 3 shifting normals you can see moving back and forward to create this kind of nice water effect that adds some sort of depth to the water. And also as it crashes into the shoreline here, we have some math that's causing this kind of foam effect, and it's really obvious to see in the fountain. And then one major thing we heard, I guess, faced early on was how to border these levels. So I think originally, Will, for clarification on this, the original idea was to just have like big buildings, right, surrounding the map.
Yeah, for sure. That was definitely the idea in my original map, was just have buildings surrounding it, and that is something that I kept in my map.
Yeah, I think because you decided on the idea to do different themes, right? With the maps.
Yes. Yeah.
And so when we realized that we didn't just want to do a major city for every single map, because it gets quite
It would have
visually.
looked. Yeah, it would have looked way too repetitive.
I decided to, especially for my map, do some kind of mountains surrounding them. And Jamie, you're going to talk about like how we used the landscape brush, right? The kind of blueprint brushes we used.
Yeah. So it was your first time experimenting with it. So we decided to go with blueprint landmass brushes, and they allow you to procedurally create the mountains just by dragging out these triangles. You can add different points to your spline, and it just drags out different mountains. And then on top of that, so if you want to texture it differently, I showed you how to procedurally vertex paint it as well, because it has sliders in there where you can just drop in the grass, you can drop in the dirt, you can say which one goes on top of which, and then you can add as many layers as you want. But we decided to keep it pretty simple with that. So blueprint landmass brushes and the procedural vertex painting on top of that.
Yeah, and I think that was one definite example where kind of all the disciplines were kind of firing on cylinders, right? Design had made this decision that we want maps with different themes. I kind of looked for a technical solution at how we could border the other maps, and James taught me how to throw these landscape brushes in. So I suppose that kind of leads us on to more talking about level design. So I'll jump to your level specifically, Will, and kind of you can talk about some of the principles, I guess, that you decided to employ.
Well, definitely one of the main things that we spoke about at the beginning was to try and sort of like keep the pizza van somewhat central on most of the levels, so that wherever the player was, once they finished all of the objectives, they would have like an equidistant amount of travel time to get to the center, which is sort of like quite a fair way of doing things. So you're not penalized for choosing a particular objective over another one to finish on last. Another one of the really, really important things which we tried to sort of like do when designing the levels was to try and make it so that each objective sort of led into another objective, or sort of like hinted at another objective, or sort of like brought the player's eye towards somewhere else which they can go to achieve an objective. Trying to get all of these things to link together without making them just sort of like a merry-go-round, so you go from one to the other, was definitely one of the core things which you focused on. Trying to have a variation in the way that sort of like in the areas looked, so that players could sort of like easily navigate around an environment. Is quite difficult in a city environment. Cities are often quite easy places to get lost in because they're quite formulaic, the way that we sort of like structure buildings. So trying to make sure that sort of like you have an area where like there's a football pitch, this place is a cafe, this place is a garden, this place is sort of like a courtyard, this place is sort of like a construction zone, was definitely really important for having the player to have those sort of like mental signposts for themselves, so that they can easily find their way around. That was definitely one of the important things for me. What else was important? Will? Sorry, that's going to be 2 cuts for me.
In the technician map for us to look at, we noticed that the buildings were being stretched on just one axis. So we said to you that we wanted them stretched on all axes, so it kept them to scale properly, and that there wasn't too many overlapping meshes. So that was one of the main pieces of feedback we gave you.
Yeah. No, testing was definitely really, really important for every single designer with their levels. Testing is 100% key to getting the gameplay, so that it's enjoyable. Players can easily find their way around, and so you're not sort of like stepping on the toes of either art or tech with the way that you're putting things together. Each round of testing that we did, I know that all the designers did multiple rounds of testing, gave us really useful feedback. We tried to test with sort of like people who were game designers, people who are game players, and just sort of like friends and things like that. So we got a whole wide range of of opinions about how it was going. And the levels did definitely change a lot. I know that my levels changed a hell of a lot from sort of like the very first version of it. It went through multiple different versions, with each one sort of like getting closer to those sort of like core ideals that we had of sort of like fast, fun, but relatively simple gameplay that pretty much anyone can pick up, get the general gist of it, and start playing, and hopefully come back for trying to do like higher scores and things like that once they finished.
I think that was another thing that we decided early on between kind of design and tech, and really kind of the group came to, is that we wanted the game to be quick. In our prototype, I had it so the player was instantly respawning, and I think we quickly latched on to that being very kind of important to the kind of core ideals of the game. The game's supposed to ultimately be fun. We weren't trying to create like a stressful, intense experience. So the fact that death carries with it very little punishment, you're rewarded for not dying, but not punished for dying, if that kind of makes sense. With the quick respawn system, it means that it doesn't feel too bad to die. But if you want to push for it and try and beat the level without dying, there is that kind of 5-star objective to push for. I suppose now moving on to kind of closing thoughts on stuff kind of we are happy about, stuff we wish we had in. I suppose I'll start off, which is I kind of wished I'd got around to creating more varied mechanics for the secret pineapple rather than just having the crane in every level, because it kind of, and only using the crane for the secret pineapple, it tends to feel just like another ingredient objective as opposed to its own kind of separate thing. And the other major thing I would have wished to get is obviously gating some of the levels to actually have this mechanic where you have to get 3 stars to unlock the next level. I guess from kind of a design point of view, what do you think we could have added, I guess, and what do you think we did well?
What I think we did well. I think that the objectives all play quite well into the sort of like core mechanics of the game. I think that they're, we set things up so that they sort of like lead into each other quite well. I think it's relatively simple to pick up and play, yet it still has sort of replay value. The score system definitely, I think, encourages players to come back and try again. It's unlikely that you'll get like your best score the first time, and there's enough going on that you'll probably want to sort of like come back and try it again. Design wise, I think that design could have sort of like put more effort in to begin with, found some more time to sort of like get some earlier blockouts and things like that, because there were a lot of things which appeared towards the end which would have been much nicer to pick up earlier and maybe make some changes and things like that. But once it comes, later on in the day, you can't expect serious changes to be made. So definitely sort of like getting the blockouts up much earlier and allowing both us, the designers, and the rest of the team to sort of like figure out, okay, this works, this doesn't work. That's 100% pivotal. So yeah, that's the main failing, I think.
Yeah, and then kind of from an art point of view, James, what do you kind of think you did well as a discipline, and what do you think you could have improved on?
Well, I think my art team worked together really well. We met our deadlines very strongly as well. We never went over on the deadlines. I think from a personal point of view, the suburb buildings I made match really well with the city buildings. I'm happy with the amount of assets that I produced, and I'm also happy with how much the rest of the team produced. Everyone created assets that worked well together. So some of them, even if they were slightly different, the texturing lacked a little bit or whatever, the shader really brought it all together. So yeah, I'm happy with how the art team worked together. Yeah, the art went from strength to strength, especially working with you, Jack, on the tech, because you helped me push how far the shader could go. You made the water that really tied a lot of things together, and then you just pushed everything, including the decals as well. You really went over the top with that. So you kind of made that personal project of yours, which just showed you how to set up a very basic decal. You then advanced that and really pushed that. So altogether, the art works well.
And to be fair, I think that's something to highlight that kind of as a group strength is the disciplines were very connected throughout. There was never a point where there wasn't design touching base with tech, or art touching base with tech, or art touching base with design. At every point, it was an interconnected process. It wasn't like small pockets of people working on their own thing. We were constantly checking base, constantly being like, is this right? How can this be tweaked? And I think realistically that brought that strengthened where everyone's weaknesses were. Being able to talk to another discipline and being like, I'm not an expert in this field. Do you think this is how we should accomplish things? Really helped, like you say, the specific examples with going through the decals and some of the kind of more technical materials in the game.
Yeah,
I think one of the really important. Oh, sorry, you go ahead, James.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, just one last thing. When I started creating my materials and my textures, I started, so on the bollards, for example, I started trying to make them realistic. And this was near the start. And then we really decided that we wanted to make them as simple as possible, just make them a base color with a gradient. So you can see the difference between the bin and the bollards, so they're like complex textures, and then the wooden pillar, like in between both of them. You can tell the difference there, and I'd say the wooden pillar works better because of how simple everything ties to, how simple the textures are and how they tie together. But yeah, that was definitely something I had to learn throughout the process. Was I didn't have to make the textures complex. I just had to go with a simple style.
Yeah, I think it's really, we made a lot of decisions as a team early on that were very fruitful in the long run. The shader was huge. The shader changes so much about how the game looks. It really pulls everything together and helps the art style kind of remain coherent.
Definitely.
And I think design-wise, deciding to do kind of short, simple, sweet, replayable levels again added so much to the gameplay. You know, these kind of decisions that we decided to do, me pitching forward that we kind of do a smaller scope game and expand from there, as opposed to scoping really big and pushing for something we knew realistically we were not going to achieve in the time.
Well, I think one of the really important things that really helped with this project is at the very beginning of the project, we all sat down as a group a hell of a lot and really discussed all of the sort of like core elements, you know, through and through as a group. So, you know, I've seen a few projects in this module from the year before and even in this year, without trying to tread on any of these toes. It's clear that they didn't discuss it enough in the beginning, and people walked away with very different ideas of what the game was going to be. Whereas I don't think obviously there's going to be misunderstandings and things like that, but I don't think we had that very much in this group. I think we all had a very good idea of where this game was going, even when things were changing. We were all trying to sort of like push forwards for a very sort of like cohesive vision. So I think that definitely really helped.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good point to end on. Is that the most important thing was making sure everyone's on the same page, constantly checking in with each other, and you know, really working as a team as instead of a kind of set of individuals, really. And I suppose that's all. So thanks very much for watching the kind of last recap, and thanks for Will and James for kind of sitting and talking out here with me.
That's all good.
No problem. Thank you.
Cheers for watching. Bye.